There are places in this world where silence carries weight, where even the faintest sound feels sacred. For me, that place was the Vatican. I was a visiting seminarian, full of hope and faith, until the night I stepped into the wrong confessional. Now, silence terrifies me. It was July 2021, and I had been staying in Vatican City for 3 weeks as part of a theological exchange program. Every evening, after the tourists left and the city grew still, I would walk to St. Peter's Basilica. It was my favorite time to pray, when the vast, marble halls echoed only with whispers of the divine. That night, I arrived later than usual. The air was cold and crisp, the faint scent of incense still lingering from the day's masses. The basilica was nearly empty except for a few clergy and a lone guard near the entrance. I found a pew near the confessional booths, knelt and bowed my head. I don't know how long I prayed, but the stillness was interrupted by the faint creak of a door. I looked up to see one of the confessional booths slightly ajar. Its red curtain swayed, though there was no breeze. Something about it drew me in. I told myself it was curiosity, but deep down I felt it was something else, something I couldn't explain. I hesitated at the entrance to the confessional. It looked like any other, polished wood, a lattice screen, the faint smell of varnish mixed with incense. But the air around it felt heavy, almost oppressive. Finally, I stepped inside. The booth was colder than I expected, the wooden seat hard and unwelcoming. I closed the door behind me, and the faint sound of the latch echoed louder than it should have. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," I began, though I wasn't sure why. At first, there was silence. Then a voice responded, soft and raspy, like dry leaves brushing against stone. "What brings you here so late?" it asked. I froze. The voice wasn't one I recognized. It didn't sound like any of the priests I had met during my stay. Still, I replied, explaining my prayer routine and my gratitude for being in such a holy place. The voice chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "Do you think this place is holy?" it asked. The question struck me as strange, almost blasphemous. Before I could respond, the voice continued, recounting sins that weren't mine. Horrible things, betrayals, violence, heresy. I think you're mistaken," I stammered. The voice laughed again. "Are you sure?" it whispered. Suddenly, the light inside the booth flickered and went out. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. I burst out of the booth, my heart pounding. The basilica was eerily silent, and the air felt colder than before. I scanned the room, expecting to see anyone, but it was empty. Even the guard near the entrance was gone. Desperate for answers, I approached a nearby altar and lit a candle. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped the match. I whispered a prayer, asking for protection, for understanding, for anything to make sense. As I turned to leave, I noticed something on the floor near the confessional. It was a small, tattered book. I picked it up and opened it, only to find it was filled with names and dates. Most of them were old, from centuries ago, but one entry caught my eye. My name, followed by that very night's date. My blood ran cold. The book slipped from my hands, and as it hit the ground, the sound reverberated unnaturally, like a distant scream. The confessional door creaked open again, and the same raspy voice called out, "Come back. We're not finished." I ran. I didn't look back, didn't care about the book or the voice or anything else. My only thought was to get out of that basilica. My footsteps echoed through the empty halls, and it felt like the shadows themselves were chasing me. When I reached the massive doors, they wouldn't budge. No matter how hard I pushed or pulled, they remained firmly shut. The voice was closer now, whispering my name, laughing softly. In a panic, I dropped to my knees and prayed louder than I ever had in my life. I begged for deliverance, for the doors to open, for the nightmare to end. The laughter grew louder, almost deafening, until suddenly it stopped. The door swung open, and I stumbled out into the cold night air. The guard was back at his post, looking at me with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked. I nodded, unable to speak, and hurried away. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in that confessional. I never went back to the basilica, and I've avoided confessional booths ever since. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that voice again, whispering from the shadows. They say some artifacts are better left untouched. When I was sent to the Vatican archives as a junior historian, I thought I'd be cataloging ancient manuscripts and forgotten relics. Instead, I uncovered something that still haunts me, a relic that wasn't supposed to exist. It was late August 2024 when I arrived at the Vatican. The heat of the Roman summer clung to the air, even within the cool marble halls of the Vatican archives. As a newly appointed historian specializing in medieval religious artifacts, I was thrilled to be here. The opportunity to work in the archives, a place shrouded in secrecy and history, was a dream come true. My assignment was straightforward: catalog and verify a series of 15th century relics recently rediscovered during renovations in a sealed-off section of the archives. The collection included chalices, vestments, and fragments of manuscripts, all stored in a room known as the Sacrum Reliquarium, the Relic Room. The archivist, Father Matteo, escorted me to the room on my first day. He was an older man with a deep, deliberate voice and a gaze that seemed to see right through you. Some of these items have not seen light in centuries, he said as he unlocked the heavy oak door. The air inside was stale and thick, carrying the scent of old wood and decaying parchment. As I stepped inside, the room felt different, too quiet, too still. Rows of shelves held items wrapped in faded cloth, each labeled with careful script. At the center of the room stood a single glass case, its contents obscured by a black velvet cover. "You will not touch this," Father Matteo said, gesturing to the case. His tone was sharp, almost fearful. "Focus on the other relics. This one is not for your hands." I nodded, though his warning left a heavy impression. As he left, locking the door behind him, I was alone in the dimly lit room, surrounded by the weight of centuries. The first few days were uneventful. I documented chalices etched with Latin prayers, fragments of manuscripts so fragile they crumbled at the edges, and vestments embroidered with gold thread. But the glass case in the center of the room gnawed at my curiosity. On the fourth day, as I was cataloging a wooden cross with faded paint, the overhead light flickered. The air grew colder, and I felt a strange pressure in my chest, as if the room itself were alive. The black cloth over the case shifted slightly, though there was no draft. I told myself it was my imagination, but as the hours passed, I couldn't resist the pull. Father Matteo's warning echoed in my mind, but it felt distant now, like a faded memory. Finally, I approached the case. My hands trembled as I lifted the velvet cloth. Beneath it was a relic unlike anything I'd ever seen. A small, silver box encrusted with blackened jewels. Its surface was etched with intricate designs, symbols that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. The lid was sealed with wax, stamped with a sigil I didn't recognize. As I leaned closer, I noticed a faint hum emanating from the box, almost imperceptible, like the vibration of a low note. My instinct was to leave it alone, but my curiosity overpowered my fear. I reached out and touched the glass. The hum grew louder. Suddenly, the light above me went out, plunging the room into darkness. A faint whisper echoed around me, though I couldn't make out the words. When the light flickered back on, the black cloth was back in place, as if I had never touched it. That night, I couldn't sleep. My dreams were filled with the symbols from the box, shifting and twisting, forming shapes I couldn't understand. When I woke, I felt an overwhelming compulsion to return to the Relic Room. I waited until the late afternoon, when most of the staff had left. Using the key Father Matteo had given me, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was colder than usual, and the hum from the box was louder now, almost insistent. I approached the case and lifted the black cloth again. This time, the wax seal on the box was broken, though I was certain it had been intact before. The lid was slightly ajar. My heart raced as I debated whether to open it fully. "Don't," a voice said behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. The room seemed darker, the shadows deeper. My reflection in the glass case looked wrong. The face staring back at me was twisted, its eyes too wide. Ignoring the warning, I lifted the lid. Inside was a small, withered object wrapped in cloth. As I unwrapped it, the hum turned into a low, guttural growl. The object was a finger bone, blackened at the edges, with tiny symbols carved into it. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and chaotic. The room felt as if it were spinning, and I stumbled back, dropping the bone. As it hit the floor, the whispers stopped, replaced by a single, deep voice. "You should not have done that." I left the Relic Room in a daze, locking the door behind me. My head throbbed, and the whispers lingered in my ears. When I returned to my quarters, I found Father Matteo waiting for me. His face was pale, his eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't place. "You opened it, didn't you?" he said, more a statement than a question. I nodded, unable to speak. "You've released something that cannot be undone," he said, his voice trembling. "That relic was sealed for a reason." Over the following days, strange things began to happen. I heard footsteps in my room at night, though no one was there. My reflection in mirrors seemed delayed, as if it were watching me before mimicking my movements. Objects moved on their own, and the whispers grew louder, more distinct. I reported everything to Father Matteo, but he only shook his head. "It's too late," he said. "You must leave the Vatican. Now." I left that evening, abandoning my position and the life I'd worked so hard to build. But the whispers followed me. Even now, months later, they haven't stopped. I see the symbols in my dreams, and sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, I feel the hum beneath my skin. The Vatican is a place where the sacred and the mysterious intertwine. For centuries, its walls have witnessed miracles and secrets alike. But when I was tasked with restoring a forgotten chapel hidden deep within the Apostolic Palace, I encountered something far darker than I ever imagined. And now I can never unsee it. It was October 2015 when I arrived in Vatican City to assist with an ongoing restoration project. My background in art conservation had brought me here, and I was honored to be part of preserving the masterpieces housed within the Vatican walls. However, the project I was assigned to wasn't what I expected. Father Pietro, an archivist with a solemn demeanor, escorted me to a section of the Apostolic Palace rarely visited by anyone. The corridors grew narrower as we walked, the air colder and heavier. Finally, we reached a set of ornate double doors, their carvings faded and worn. "This chapel hasn't been used in centuries," Father Pietro explained as he unlocked the doors. "It was sealed off after an incident. Your job is to restore the altar fresco and document any artifacts inside. Work quickly and avoid lingering after sundown." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I nodded. The doors creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit chapel. Dust motes swirled in the weak sunlight, filtering through narrow, stained glass windows. The centerpiece was the altar, a crumbling fresco of the Virgin Mary, her face faded and cracked. Above it, a large crucifix hung at an odd angle. The air felt wrong, as if the room itself was alive and watching me. I pushed the feeling aside, focusing on the task at hand. But as I unpacked my tools, I couldn't shake the sensation of being observed. I began my work the next morning. The fresco was in worse shape than I'd anticipated, the paint flaking away to reveal strange, dark stains beneath. As I carefully removed layers of grime, I noticed something odd. The Virgin Mary's eyes seemed to shift slightly, as if watching me. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a result of the uneven surface. By midday, I had unearthed an inscription at the base of the fresco. It was in Latin, and though my knowledge of the language was limited, I recognized enough to translate part of it. "He who watches from the shadows shall never rest." The words sent a shiver through me. I photographed the inscription and made a note to show it to Father Pietro, but he was nowhere to be found that evening. Alone in the chapel, I heard the first sound, a faint scraping, like nails on stone, coming from behind the altar. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed. The sound grew louder, more deliberate. Summoning my courage, I approached the altar, my flashlight casting long, flickering shadows. I found nothing behind it except cold stone. But as I turned to leave, the crucifix above the altar fell, crashing to the ground with a deafening clang. The following night, I decided to continue my work despite the growing unease. The chapel seemed darker now, even with the lights I'd brought in. The shadows stretched unnaturally, and the air carried a faint, metallic scent. As I worked, the scraping sound returned, louder and closer this time. I spun around, flashlight in hand, but the room was empty. Then I saw it, a shadow on the far wall, humanoid in shape but twisted, its limbs unnaturally long. It wasn't cast by anything in the room. It moved independently, sliding across the wall as if alive. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice echoing in the empty chapel. The shadow stopped, its head tilting unnaturally, as if studying me. Then, without warning, it darted toward me, disappearing into the wall behind the altar. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking. My instinct was to flee, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The air grew colder, and a low whisper filled the room, repeating a single phrase in Latin, "Noli me tanhere." Do not touch me. I gathered my tools and left the chapel, vowing not to return. But as I locked the doors, I realized the shadow had followed me. It lingered in the glass of the windows, faint but unmistakable. Despite my fears, Father Pietro insisted I finish the restoration. "You're almost done," he said. "Do not leave it unfinished." Reluctantly, I returned to the chapel one last time. The atmosphere was suffocating, the whispers louder now, overlapping and chaotic. I worked quickly, determined to complete the task and leave. As I applied the final layer of sealant to the fresco, the lights went out. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the chapel. I turned, and there it was, the shadow no longer confined to the walls. It stood in the center of the room, taller than before, its eyes glowing faintly red. It raised an arm, pointing directly at me. My body froze, my breath caught in my throat. "Leave," it said, the word resonating in my mind rather than my ears. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my bag and ran, not stopping until I was outside in the cool night air. I told Father Pietro everything, but he only nodded solemnly. "The chapel was sealed for a reason," he said. "You should never have entered." The next day, I left the Vatican, abandoning the project. Weeks later, I learned that the chapel had been sealed again, its doors reinforced, and its existence erased from the records. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers, faint and distant, as if they're calling me back.